What if humanity's greatest breakthroughs are not the fruit of genius, but a scar left by catastrophe? What if a new world is always born from ash, and the price of its birth is the old world, burned to the ground? History rarely speaks of this directly. It prefers to tell of heroes and battles, but remains silent about how, in the ringing silence after a plague, a man who was yesterday a serf first dared to raise his head and speak of wages, or how, in the mud of Agincourt, in a mountain of noble knights' corpses, it was not just an army that was buried, but an entire social order making way for faceless and ruthless efficiency. We look to the past for lessons of glory, but what if the most important lesson is hidden in its darkest failures? What if everything we call progress is merely a desperate attempt to survive after the world has already ended once before? Imagine Paris, March 18th, 1314. The air is damp and cold, carrying the smell of the river and smoke. On the Ile de la Cité, in the shadow of the still under construction Notre Dame Cathedral, a crowd is gathered. This is not an idle crowd, not gawkers at a fair. In their eyes is a mixture of fear, curiosity, and grim anticipation. In the center, on a scaffold, stands an old man. His clothes are rags, but his posture is unbroken. This is Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. He looks directly at the royal balcony, at a face as if carved from marble, at King Philip IV, known as the Fair. Over 7 years, the king and his puppet pope, Clement V, had destroyed the most powerful order in Christendom. They tortured, lied, and burned. And now, the finale. What did Philip feel in that moment? Triumph? The satisfaction of knowing the crown's treasury would soon be filled with the Templars' immeasurable wealth? Or deep within him, behind the icy mask of the statesman, did a cold sliver of doubt stir? As the flames touched Jacques de Molay's feet, his voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. It was not a cry of pain. It was the voice of a prophet. Pope Clement, King Philip, before this year is out, I will summon you to God's judgment. The crowd fell silent. This was not a plea for mercy. It was a curse, and history, like an obedient screenwriter, began to fulfill his will. Just 1 month later, Pope Clement V died in agony, his body, left in a church, incinerated by a lightning strike. And in the autumn of that same year, 1314, the Iron King himself, Philip the Fair, fell from his horse during a hunt, not by an enemy's sword, not by poison, but by a simple accident. He died on November 29th, leaving France in disarray. A curse, or merely a tragic coincidence? For the people, the answer was obvious. But this was only the beginning. The French crown, which had seemed an unshakable rock during 3 centuries of Capetian rule, suddenly began to crumble like sand. Philip's eldest son, Louis VI, the quarrelsome, ascended the throne. His reign was short and inglorious. After just 2 years, he died, leaving only a pregnant wife. All of France held its breath. A boy was born, John the Fir, the posthumous, a king for 5 days. A fragile shoot of the dynasty, broken almost as soon as it sprouted into the light. The throne passed to the next brother, Philip V, the Tall. He ruled for 6 years and died, leaving no sons. Then the crown was worn by the last of the Iron King's sons, Charles IV, also called the Fair. And again, the same story. 6 years of rule, and death without a male heir. 3 sons of the great Philip succeeded one another on the throne in 14 years, and all went to their graves leaving only daughters behind. The direct line of the Capetian dynasty was extinguished. And here, the shadow of the curse transformed into the storm cloud of war. For there was also Philip the Fair's daughter, Isabella of France, the she-wolf of France. She was the Queen of England, mother to the young King Edward III. By blood, he was the closest male relative, the Iron King's grandson. But the French barons shuddered. Hand the crown of France to an Englishman? They dredged up the ancient Salic law from dusty archives, which forbade women from inheriting land, and declared, "A woman cannot transmit a right she does not herself possess." The crown was given to the late king's cousin, Philip of Valois, who became Philip VI. In London, this was seen as an insult and a theft. The curse of Jacques de Molay was not a magic spell. It became a self-fulfilling political prophecy, sowing seeds of doubt and fear. The dynastic crisis was not just a family tragedy. It was a crack in the very foundation of the French kingdom. And the choice made by the French nobility did not just determine a new king. It lit the fuse that would lead to the 100-year fire of war. Imagine Britain, 60 AD. The air is damp and cold, smelling of peat smoke and moist earth. In the lands of the Iceni tribe, their client king, Prasutagus, is dying. He was no naive man. He had seen the shadow of the Roman eagle spread across the island. In his last will, written on parchment in cold, official Latin letters, he tries to strike a deal with fate. He bequeaths half of his wealthy kingdom to the Roman emperor and the other half to his daughters, hoping to buy a fragile peace for his people and his family. It was a gesture of desperation, an attempt to appease the beast already at his door. But Rome does not make deals with those it considers subjects. Rome commands. And for the procurator, Catus Decianus, the will of Prasutagus was not a treaty, but an inventory list. Roman soldiers came not to divide the inheritance, but to take it all. The lands of the Iceni were declared imperial property. Their nobles were reduced to the status of slaves, and when the widow of Prasutagus, Queen Boudica, dared to protest, she was shown the true face of the new authority. She was publicly flogged. Her daughters were raped. What did she feel in that moment? Humiliation? A rage so pure and searing it could have melted iron? In that instant, the personal tragedy of a mother and a violated queen became the spark in a powder keg of resentment that had been building for years. That spark ignited all of southeastern Britain. The Iceni rose up, and they were immediately joined by their neighbors, the Trinovantes, from whom the Romans had seized land to build their new symbolic city, Camulodunum. The rage that had been accumulating for years erupted. This was not an army. It was a hurricane of human vengeance. The first target was Camulodunum itself, modern-day Colchester. The city built as a monument to Roman conquest was burned to the ground. Its inhabitants, Roman veterans and their families, were slaughtered without mercy. Then the fury fell upon the 9th Legion, sent to crush the rebellion. The celebrated legion was virtually annihilated, its remnants fleeing in panic. The myth of Roman invincibility crumbled to dust on the fields of Britain. While his province burned, the Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was at the other end of the island, on Mona, modern Anglesey, wiping out a Druid stronghold. Hearing of the catastrophe, he made a desperate forced march south. He reached Londinium, a thriving commercial port, but realized he lacked the forces to defend it, and he made a brutal but pragmatic decision: to sacrifice the city. Londinium and the next city in the rebels' path, Verulamium, modern St. Albans, shared Camulodunum's fate. They were burned and their populations exterminated. Imagine Suetonius watching the smoke on the horizon. Did he feel like an executioner condemning thousands to death, or a cold strategist amputating a gangrenous limb to save the body of the empire? Finally, having gathered his remaining forces, the 14th Legion Gemina and parts of the 20th Valeria Victrix, Suetonius chose a place for the decisive battle, a narrow valley protected by a forest at its rear, where the Celts' numerical superiority would mean nothing. There, facing a roaring horde led by the warrior queen in her chariot, the Roman war machine demonstrated its monstrous efficiency. Discipline defeated fury. The short gladius swords did their work. The rebellion was drowned in blood. This was not just a suppressed revolt. It was a brutal lesson, seared into the memory of both Rome and Britain, a lesson that even the most powerful empire can provoke a fury capable of burning it to the ground. And though the flame was extinguished, the shadow of Boudica, the shadow of a violated queen, would forever linger in the land, a reminder that beneath the conqueror's boot, the spark of freedom always smolders. Imagine the smell. A mixture of salt, tarred ropes, rotting fish, and cheap wine hanging in the thick air of the port of La Rochelle. Imagine the sounds, the cries of gulls, the creak of masts, and the coarse, drunken shouts in two languages that are becoming increasingly indistinguishable in the general din. It all begins here, in the muck and noise, with a common brawl. A dispute between English and Norman sailors over a drink of water or a careless word, fists, knives, blood on the wet planks of the quay, an incident that in any other year would have been forgotten by morning. But not this year. This petty skirmish is merely a spark that has fallen into a powder keg filled over decades by two kings. In Paris, in his palace, sits Philip IV, called the Fair. But his beauty is as cold as steel. He is a lawyer on the throne, a man who thinks in terms of laws and paragraphs that he himself writes. For him, the world is not a battlefield, but a courtroom, and he is the chief prosecutor. Across the channel is his complete opposite, Edward the Fern of England, Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots, a warrior king forged in crusades and countless battles, a man of iron and will for whom law is the point of his sword, and between them lies a wound that never heals. Gascony, the rich, sun-drenched land around Bordeaux, English by right of inheritance, but geographically part of France. Edward possesses it, but as Philip's vassal, a humiliating position for such a man. And Philip, like a skilled spider, begins to weave his web. He uses the brawl in La Rochelle as a pretext. He summons Edward, his vassal, to his court in Paris. What did Edward feel upon receiving this letter? Humiliation? Rage? Or a cold calculation, understanding that this was a trap with no honorable escape? He refused, and Philip did what he had been waiting for all along. He declared the confiscation of Gascony. But this was just one move in a great game. Edward's gaze was fixed northward, on Scotland. He seems obsessed with the idea of conquering that wild, proud land. He deposes one king, John Balliol, and installs his own governor. But from the mists and hills rises the ghost of resistance. First William Wallace, and then the cunning and unyielding Robert Bruce. While Edward is bogged down in the Scottish marshes, spilling blood and gold, Philip strikes from another side. He forms an alliance with his enemy's enemy. The Auld Alliance between France and Scotland becomes a reality. Now, the Scottish thistle is a dagger that France holds to England's throat, and there is a third chessboard. Flanders, a land of cloth workshops, wealthy cities, the hub of European trade. The Count of Flanders, Guy of Dampierre, desperately tries to maintain his independence, caught between a rock and a hard place. His cities grow rich on English wool, but politically, he is a vassal of the French crown. When Philip invades Flanders to subjugate it, he strikes not only at the Count, but also at Edward's purse. Gascony, Scotland, Flanders. These are not three different wars. They are three heads of a single dragon, inflamed by the ambitions of two monarchs. Each of these clashes was like a crack in the ice, spreading further and further. They created a web of mutual grievances, alliances, and betrayals that entangled all of Western Europe. This was not yet the 100 Years' War, but here, in these local conflicts, its seeds were sown. It was here that the hatred and mistrust between England and France ceased to be the affair of kings and became the sentiment of entire nations. Imagine, June 24th, 1340, the Bay of Slies. The air is thick and salty, smelling of wet wood, tar, and a quiet, oppressive anticipation. Before the eyes of the English King Edward III is not just an enemy fleet. It is a dead forest of masts, a palisade of hundreds of ships that the French King Philip VI had ordered chained together, turning his armada into an impregnable floating fortress. They were certain of their strength, of their righteousness. What did Edward feel in that moment, looking at that wall of wood and men? The thrill of anticipation, or the chilling terror of a gambler who has wagered everything? His army, his crown, his very claim to the throne of France. He saw not just ships, he saw a locked gate to a kingdom he believed was his by right of blood. And in his hands he held a key that France did not yet know, the long yew bow. When the English ships, using the wind and sun at their backs, smashed into the French lines, the air was torn by a sound unfamiliar to naval battles. It was not steel striking steel. It was the gruesome, singing hum of thousands of drawn bowstrings. Clouds of arrows, released with murderous accuracy, rained down on the decks of the French ships. Knights in heavy armor, the pride of France, found themselves helpless targets in this cramped slaughterhouse. They were warriors of the land, trapped on the water. By sunset, the water in the bay had turned red. The sea, impartial to human ambitions, had swallowed the French fleet, and with it, the hope of keeping the English on their island. The channel was open. The victory at Slies was deafening, but the sea is not the land. 6 years later, in August 1346, the scene changed. Instead of salt water, there was rain-soaked earth near the village of Crécy. Edward's army was exhausted, hungry, and heavily outnumbered by the forces of Philip VI. The French looked with scorn upon the handful of Englishmen who had taken the top of a hill. For them, the flower of European chivalry, this was not a battle, but a hunt. The question was not who would win, but how much glory each would claim. But they had once again failed to account for that same sound. First came the failed attack of the Genoese crossbowmen, whose bowstrings had gone slack in the rain. And then the French knights, impatient and eager for glory, charged. A wave of steel and pride rolled up the slope, only to break against an invisible wall. This wall was made of common English yeomen, peasants whose only aristocracy lay in their deadly skill with a bow. The bowstrings sang again, and an iron rain fell upon the French nobility. Arrows pierced armor, killed horses, turning a noble charge into a bloody chaos. Chivalry, as an idea, as a tactic, as the very essence of medieval warfare, was dying in the mud of Crécy, struck down by the hands of commoners. Watching his son, the young Black Prince, hold his own in the thick of the fight, Edward III refused to send reinforcements, saying, "Let the boy win his spurs." He was not just winning a battle, he was forging a dynasty. Slies and Crécy were not just victories. They were two hammer blows that shattered the foundations of the old world. The first gave England the sea and a path into France. The second proved that a commoner with a piece of wood in his hands could bring a steel-clad aristocrat to his knees. At Crécy, A new, brutal England was born, and old chivalrous France received a wound that would fester for a century. Imagine the silence, not the kind that brings peace, but the oppressive, ringing silence of the Gobi Desert. Here, in the heart of Asia, in the mid-14th century, an ancient terror awoke. It had no voice, no form. It was a microscopic passenger in the blood of a small rodent, patiently waiting for its moment. Along the trade arteries of the Great Silk Road, from caravan to caravan, it began its journey west. An invisible horseman of the apocalypse, whose footfalls no one yet heard. In 1346, its path led it to the walls of Kaffa, a Genoese trading fortress in the Crimea. The city was under siege by the army of the Golden Horde, commanded by Khan Janibeg. Months of siege had borne no fruit. But then a new, unexpected ally and enemy appeared in the Mongol camp: disease. The Khan's soldiers began to die agonizing deaths, their bodies covered in black sores. The army was melting away. What did Janibeg feel in that moment? Desperation? Rage that victory was slipping away because of an invisible foe? In his mind, a plan was born, monstrous in its simplicity and genius, a plan that would forever change history. The catapults, which had previously hurled stones into the city, fell silent. Then they sprang to life again. But now, it was not stones flying over the walls of Kaffa. The corpses of Mongol warriors, bloated, blackened, and still carrying their deadly cargo, soared into the sky. This was not mere desecration. It was the first documented act of biological warfare in history. Imagine the terror of the defenders as death fell upon their streets. Not a swift death from a sword, but a slow, rotting, contagious one. The siege was lifted, but it was too late. A few Genoese ships, breaking through the blockade, sped for home, for Italy. They thought they had escaped. They were carrying a curse. In October 1347, 12 galleys with the black sails of death entered the harbor of the Sicilian port of Messina. On deck, almost everyone was dead or dying in agony, covered in black buboes that oozed pus and blood. The port authorities, horrified, ordered the ships to leave, but it was too late. The invisible passenger had already come ashore. The rats, and with them the fleas, were the first to abandon the ghost ships. From Messina, the plague flooded the continent like a black tidal wave. Marseille, Paris, London. Cities fell one after another. Society began to disintegrate. What is it like to see your neighbor, with whom you drank wine yesterday, writhing in fever today, and tomorrow his body is carted away with dozens of others? Sons abandoned fathers, mothers their children. Priests who came to give last rites to the dying died themselves. Prayers did not work. The church, for centuries an unshakable rock, was silent, unable to explain why God had unleashed such wrath upon his people. Despair gave birth to fanaticism, processions of flagellants, self-floggers trying to atone for the world's sins with their own blood, snaked along the roads of Europe. And it also gave birth to hatred. Pogroms erupted in cities, blaming Jews, lepers, and foreigners for the plague. The world was going mad. When the wave receded, it had carried away, by various estimates, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. It was a demographic catastrophe without parallel. But from the ashes of this all-consuming fire, a new world began to sprout. The death of millions of peasants created an acute labor shortage, and those who were yesterday rightless serfs could for the first time demand payment for their labor, shattering the very foundations of the feudal system. This was not just an epidemic that devastated a continent. It was a tectonic shift that broke the spine of the Middle Ages. The plague called into question the authority of both church and state, clearing the ground for the doubts of the Renaissance and the fury of the Reformation. The Europe that survived the embrace of the Black Death would never be the same again. Imagine. The morning of September 19th, 1356. The air over the fields near Poitiers is thick and humid, smelling of wet grass and fear. 10 years have passed since the triumph at Crécy, but now the English army is exhausted. For weeks, like a wolf pack, it has ravaged France in a brutal raid known as a chevauchée. Now the wolves are cornered. Before them, gleaming in the sun with thousands of banners and coats of arms, stands the full chivalric might of France. At the head of the English is Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince. He is only 26, but his name has already become synonymous with war. What did he feel in that moment, looking at that sea of steel and silk, 5 times larger than his own army? Despair, or the cold thrill of a gambler who has wagered an entire kingdom? His army is hungry, weary, and cut off from any line of retreat. By all the laws of war and honor, he was doomed. But Edward had his own unchivalrous answer to the laws of honor: long yew boughs. As the French knights, led by their king, John II the Good, began their attack, the sky darkened. This was not a noble duel. It was a slaughter. Hundreds of thousands of arrows shrieked as they bit into flesh, into armor, into unprotected horses. The first wave of the French attack choked on its own chaos, turning into a mountain of writhing bodies and screaming animals. King John, the embodiment of medieval valor, made a fatal mistake. He dismounted to fight shoulder to shoulder with his knights on foot, setting an example of courage. But in this bloody mud, courage was useless. It only slowed him down, made him vulnerable. As his nobility died around him, the Black Prince struck from the flank. And then the unthinkable happened. The King of France, God's anointed, was surrounded and captured on his own soil. In an instant, the crown of France transformed from a symbol of power into a bargaining chip. The king's capture was a wound for France deeper than any military defeat. It paralyzed the country. 4 years of humiliating negotiations led to the signing of the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. The terms were crushing. England received full, sovereign ownership of vast territories, all of historic Aquitaine, Gascony, Calais, and Ponthieu. For the return of their monarch, France was obliged to pay a monstrous ransom, 3 million gold écus, a sum capable of bankrupting any European state. In exchange, the English King Edward III graciously renounced his claim to the French throne. He was trading a phantom dream for a third of a real kingdom. This was not just a victory in battle or a favorable treaty. It was the moment when the scales of power in Europe swung with a deafening screech, reaching their tipping point. England, an island kingdom, stood at the zenith of its power, having humiliated and fractured its eternal rival. But history teaches that from such heights, one sees not only a view of conquered lands, but also a long, perilous path down. Imagine France, not the France of vineyards and castles, but a land scorched to the bone. Imagine the silence of fields where fear grows instead of wheat. The air is thick with the smell of old ash and recent defeat. This is a kingdom brought to its knees, humiliated at Crécy and Poitiers, a kingdom whose king had been a captive and whose aristocracy was a laughingstock. The English lion, it seemed, would feast on the body of France forever. But in the shadow of this humiliation, in the quiet of offices rather than on the tournament grounds, a plan was being born. Its author was no warrior. Charles V, called the Wise, was a frail, sickly man who preferred books to the sword. He looked at the map of his ravaged kingdom. not as a knight seeking glory, but as a surgeon studying a wound. What did he feel, looking at the lands ceded to Edward III? Powerless rage? Or a cold, calculating certainty that brute force must be overcome by the power of the mind? He understood what his father and grandfather had not. Trying to best England in open battle was suicide. Honor was a luxury France could no longer afford, and for this dirty, ignoble work, he needed a special tool, not a knight without fear and beyond reproach, but a wolf. His name was Bertrand du Guesclin. Ugly, ferocious, risen from the lower Breton nobility, he was the embodiment of war without rules. Du Guesclin was the sword, and Charles was the hand that guided it. Together, they created a new doctrine, a strategy the ancient Romans called Fabian. Its essence was simple and humiliating for the proud French barons. Do not fight. Never accept a pitched battle. In 1369, when Charles V found a pretext and officially confiscated Aquitaine from Edward the Black Prince, the war resumed. The English, led by famed commanders like Robert Knowles and John of Gaunt, invaded France once more, expecting a glorious battle. But they were met with emptiness. They marched through a scorched earth where villages were burned and wells were poisoned. Their huge armies, famous for their devastating chevauchée raids, melted away from hunger and disease, harassed by an invisible enemy. Bertrand du Guesclin and his flying columns struck from ambushes, intercepted supply trains, killed foragers, and vanished into the forests like ghosts. It was a war of 1,000 small cuts, slowly bleeding the English lion dry. Step by step, city by city, the French, like an inexorable tide, began to win back their lands: Poitou, Saintonge, Angoumois. But Charles's strategy was not confined to the land. He built a new, powerful fleet under the command of Admiral Jean de Vienne, and for the first time in decades, the war came to England itself. French ships burned the southern coast, raiding Rye, Gravesend, Portsmouth, Dartmouth. The English, accustomed to fighting on foreign soil, felt for the first time the same terror they had sown themselves. The great warriors of England were passing away. The Black Prince died in 1376, and his father, the mighty Edward III, a year later. And in 1380, within months of each other, the two architects of the French recovery also departed. First, Bertrand du Guesclin, who died while besieging yet another castle, and then Charles V the Wise himself. He died, knowing that his humiliating but brilliant strategy had worked. By the end of his reign, the English controlled only the port of Calais and a narrow coastal strip from Bordeaux to Bayonne. This was not just a military campaign. It was a quiet revolution in the art of war, where intellect and patience proved more important than knightly valor. France learned to win not by the strength of its muscles, but by the strength of its will, turning its own weakness into a deadly weapon. This scar on the pride of the English lion, and this lesson in survival for France would define the entire future course of the 100 Years' War. Imagine Paris in the early 15th century. Forget the City of Light. This Paris smells of fear. It smells of wet straw on filthy streets, of cold stone, and the smoke from thousands of hearths in which the last hopes are burning. At night, one hears not the songs of troubadours, but the drunken shouts of mercenaries and the anxious, frantic tolling of church bells, as if they are chanting a requiem for France itself. In the very heart of this city, in the Louvre, there is a gaping void. Not on the throne. A king still sits there. The emptiness is in his eyes. The king's name is Charles VI, but the people have already given him another name, Charles the Mad. His mind is a fragile vessel, shattered to pieces. One day he is a monarch dispensing favors. The next, a wretched creature convinced his body is made of glass and could shatter at the slightest touch. And while the king wanders the labyrinths of his own mind, the kingdom, his kingdom, becomes prey for wolves. 2 wolves proved stronger and hungrier than the rest. Both were of royal blood. The first was his own brother, Duke Louis of Orléans. Handsome, a dandy, a favorite of Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, he spends the treasury on feasts and mistresses, feeling power almost within his grasp. What did he feel, looking at his brother's empty eyes? Compassion? Or impatient anticipation, the sweet taste of power that was about to fall into his hands? He believed France was his by right of birth. The second was his cousin, John the Fearless, the powerful Duke of Burgundy, stern, calculating, a man who knew how to speak to the Parisian mob in its own language. He promised order, lower taxes, justice. He positioned himself as the defender of the unfortunate king and the disenfranchised people. But what lay behind this mask of a people's champion? Genuine concern for the country, or a thirst for absolute power as cold as the steel of his dagger, for which anyone and anything could be sacrificed? France was split in 2. Behind one stood the Armagnacs, behind the other, the Burgundians. This was no longer just a court intrigue. These were 2 parties, armed to the teeth, at each other's throats. Paris became their battlefield. Murders, robberies, street fights. The country was devouring itself from within, while its mad king played cards, recognizing no one around him. The climax came on a dark November night in 1407. On the narrow Parisian street of Vieille du Temple, Louis of Orléans was brutally murdered by assassins. They chopped off his hand, smashed his skull. The man who ordered it did not hide for long. John the Fearless publicly confessed to the act, declaring the murder a political necessity, a tyrannicide for the good of France. This murder did not bring peace. It became the trigger for a full-scale civil war that would drench France in blood for decades. The madness of one man and the ambition of 2 others threw open the gates to a chaos that would prove more terrible than any external enemy. This wound, which France inflicted upon itself, would prove so deep that very soon English armies would pour through it to seize the undefended crown. Imagine the morning of October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day. The air is thick and heavy, saturated with the smell of cold mud, wet wool, and encroaching human fear. Before you is a field near the village of Agincourt. This is not a battlefield. It is a rain-soaked, plowed trap of clay, ready to swallow both glory and life. On one side, the army of England. Exhausted by a long march, ravaged by dysentery, it looks like a handful of ghosts pressed against a wood. Their king, Henry V, is young, not yet 30. He looks at his depleted ranks, at the faces of common archers whose hands are accustomed to working with yew wood, not to the gleam of chivalric tournaments. What did he feel in that moment, looking upon the invincible French might? Despair? Or a cold, predatory calculation born from an understanding of his enemy's weakness? This was not faith in a miracle. It was faith in geometry, in physics, and in human arrogance. And on the other side? On the other side was an ocean of banners, heraldic coats of arms, and the gleam of polished steel. The flower of French chivalry, an aristocracy gathered under the command of Constable Charles d'Albret. They were so confident in their victory that, according to legend, they were already dividing the yet-to-be-captured English prisoners among themselves. For them, this was not war, but a hunt, a glorious exercise in valor that would be over by noon. They saw before them not an army, but prey. What does a man encased in dozens of pounds of iron feel when his warhorse begins to sink into sticky, sucking clay? The magnificent advance turned into a slow, agonizing struggle. The pride of France, its sons clad in steel, became perfect targets. Their armor, a symbol of status and invulnerability, turned into steel coffins, dragging them down into the mud, and in that moment, the sky darkened. Not from clouds, it darkened from thousands of English arrows. This was not the sound of battle. It was the methodical industrial hum of death, as yew-bows, the weapons of commoners, time and again pierced the plate of aristocrats. Agincourt was not just a battle. It was a slaughter that became an epitaph for an entire class of warrior. On that day, the heavy knight, for centuries the lord of the battlefield, was humiliated and destroyed by a simple English yeoman. France was decapitated in a matter of hours, losing a whole generation of its nobility and military leaders, leaving the country open to conquest. It was a scar that would prove that even the proudest nation can be broken not only by the force of arms, but by the weight of its own hubris. Imagine the Cathedral of Troy, May 21st, 1420. Imagine the cold light that pours through the stained glass windows, coloring the stone floor in hues of blood and gold. The air is thick, heavy with the scent of incense and unspoken tension. There is no clash of steel here, only the quiet, almost sinister scratch of a quill on parchment. This sound is the sound of an entire nation's surrender, the sound with which the fate of France is being rewritten. At the center of this silent vortex are figures, frozen as if in an old master's painting. There he is, Henry V, King of England, the victor of Agincourt. His gaze is firm, holding not the joy of a conqueror, but the icy focus of an architect who sees his grand design taking shape. What did he feel in that moment? The elation of a conqueror, or the weight of two crowns that were about to rest on his shoulders? For him, this is not just a victory. It is the fulfillment of divine will, the correction of a century-old injustice. He is not conquering France. He is taking back what is his by right of blood. And opposite him is tragedy incarnate. The King of France, Charles VI, called the mad. He is sitting here, but he is not here. His eyes are vacant, his mind wandering in dark labyrinths where kings are made of glass and subjects are enemies. He is a ghost at the feast, signing away his own kingdom, his own son. Beside him is his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, a woman whom French history would curse as a traitor. Did she look at her broken husband, at the English king, and see in this treaty the only way to end the slaughter? Or was it the cold calculation of a queen, saving her own power at the cost of her country's future and her child's blood? For that is precisely what was written on the parchment. Henry V would marry their daughter, Catherine of Valois, and become regent and heir to the French throne. And the legitimate heir, the Dauphin Charles, was declared a bastard, illegitimate, struck from history with a single stroke of the pen, with ink that seemed mixed with blood. This treaty was made possible not only by English swords, it was made possible by a French dagger. The murder of Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy on the bridge at Montereau by the Dauphin's supporters had thrown his son, Philip the Good, into the arms of the English. Vengeance proved stronger than patriotism, and now Philip stood beside Henry, watching as his thirst for revenge helped to dismember his homeland. Thus was born a chimera, a dual monarchy. The English lion was to lie down with the French lily. London and Paris were to become the capitals of a single empire under the rule of the House of Lancaster. For Henry, this was the peak, the summit of his conquests, the moment when the dream of 3 generations of English kings seemed to have come true. But this treaty was not the end of the war, but its new, even more ferocious beginning. It did not unite two kingdoms. It split France in two, leaving an unhealing scar on its body. By trying to destroy one heir, the Treaty of Troyes unwittingly created a symbol of resistance, a banner around which all who refused the rule of a foreign king would rally. Imagine Orléans in the spring of 1429. It is not a city, but an open wound. The air is thick with the smell of burning, of fear, and of stale despair. For nearly 7 months, English forces, like a pack of wolves, have been tightening the ring of siege. Every day is the roar of trebuchets, the whistle of arrows, and the dull thud of hope hitting the ground and shattering. For the city's defenders, for all of France, which no longer has a king, but only a humiliated Dauphin Charles hiding in the castle of Chinon, this is the end. The war, which has lasted for nearly a century, is approaching its finale, and that finale is defeat. And into this darkness, a girl walks, not a warrior, not an aristocrat, a peasant from the village of Domremy, barely 17 years old. Her name is Joan. She claims to hear the voices of saints, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret. She says she is sent by God. Imagine the skepticism of battle-hardened captains like Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, or the fierce mercenary La Hire. They had seen everything war had to offer, but they had never seen anything like this. What did they feel, looking at her? Pity, annoyance, or a secret, shameful glimmer of hope they were afraid to admit even to themselves? For she had already achieved the impossible. She had convinced the cynical commander Robert de Baudricourt in Vaucouleurs. She had passed through enemy territory to Chinon, and there, in a hall full of courtiers, had unerringly identified Charles, who was trying to hide in the crowd. What must this indecisive, almost broken Dauphin have felt? He, whose right to the throne was contested by everyone, including his own mother. Was he ready to believe in a miracle because he simply had no other cards left to play? Or in her burning eyes, did he see something more than just fanaticism? Did he see a certainty that he so desperately lacked himself? After lengthy interrogations by theologians in Poitiers, who could find no heresy in her, he took a gamble on the Maid of Lorraine, of whom an old prophecy spoke. And now, she is in Orléans, not a strategist, but a symbol, a living banner around which demoralized soldiers rallied. On May 4th, she leads them in an assault on the Bastille of Saint-Lô. On May 7th, the decisive attack on the main English fortress, Les Tourelles. In the heat of battle, an arrow pierces her shoulder. She is carried from the field. The enemy rejoices. But moments later, she returns, having pulled the arrow from her wound, and once again leads the men forward. What was this? A supernatural will? Or simply the incredible fortitude of a teenager who believed in her mission so absolutely that pain and the fear of death did not exist for her? By evening, Les Tourelles had fallen. On May 8th, 1429, the English lifted the siege. The miracle had happened, but Orléans was only the beginning. Next came the swift Loire campaign, victory after victory, culminating in the Battle of Patay, a crushing rout of the English, where their famed longbowmen were simply swept away by French cavalry. This was not just a battle, it was a psychological turning point. The soldiers who had recently considered the English invincible now believed that God was with them. And they were led by a warrior angel whose name was on the lips of all France, including such ambiguous companions as the future Marshal Gilles de Rais. And here it is, the moment of truth. July 17th, 1429. The ancient vaults of Reims Cathedral, the place where French monarchs had been crowned for centuries. Charles VII, who just yesterday was a nobody, now stands before the altar to receive the sacred chrism. And beside him, with her banner in hand, stands Joan, the peasant girl from Domremy. Her mission is complete. She lifted the siege of Orléans and brought her king to his coronation. In this moment of triumph, seeing her faith made flesh and crowned, what did she feel? The completion of her journey? Or a terrible premonition that the loudest chapter of her story was merely a prelude to her martyrdom? This event was far more than just a military success or a political ritual. The coronation at Reims legitimized not only Charles VII, it legitimized the very idea of divine intervention in the fate of a nation. It transformed a dynastic conflict into a sacred war of liberation, breathing a soul and a will to win into a fractured country. The crack that ran through the body of France began to heal, but the scar from this miracle, and its price, would remain forever. Imagine Rouen, the winter of 1431. The air in the castle chapel is thick and cold, smelling of damp stone, wax, and stale fear. Here, in the lair of English power, a 19-year-old girl in men's clothing stands before 70 of the most learned and influential men of the church. Their faces are inscrutable masks, their robes black waves ready to engulf her. This is not a trial. It is a meticulously staged performance where the verdict was written long before the curtain rose. At the center of this theater of the absurd is Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, a man of incredible intellect and even greater ambition. What did he feel, looking at this stubborn, illiterate peasant girl who had single-handedly overturned all his political calculations? Did he see in her a messenger of the devil, as the records would claim? Or did he see only an instrument, a key to winning the favor of the English and a cardinal's hat? Each of his questions is not a search for truth, but a perfectly honed theological trap. He is trying to catch God in the snares of canon law, to force her to renounce not her saints' voices, but her very self, the spark that had lit the flame of hope in French hearts. And she, Joan, captured by the Burgundians at Compiègne and sold to the English like a piece of property, what did she feel during these endless months of interrogation? Exhaustion, loneliness, and the icy calm of faith. Her answers, simple and direct, disarmed her accusers, exasperating the doctors of the Sorbonne. She was a lone candle flame in a hurricane of dogma, and that light burned their eyes, and somewhere far away, in safety, the man she had brought to the crown, Charles VII, remained silent. Was it fear, political calculation, or the cold realization that a living maid was a problem, but a dead martyr was a banner? May 30th, 1431. The old market square in Rouen. The smoke from the pyre mixes with the morning fog. The crowd is a churning sea of curiosity, hatred, and secret sympathy. When the fire touched her feet, she did not curse her executioners. She asked for only one thing: to hold a cross up high, so she could see it until the very end. In that moment, the fire ceased to be merely an instrument of execution. It became a crucible in which flesh was burned and a myth was born. An English soldier, as legend has it, cried out in horror, "We are lost, we have burned a saint." They had tried to burn a heretic to prove the illegitimacy of Charles VII's coronation, but the flames created an immortal symbol. Joan's ashes, scattered over the Seine, became the seeds from which a new, united France would grow, ready to fight to the end. Her execution was not the finale, but the catalyst that transformed the 100 Years' War from a dynastic dispute into a sacred war for the homeland. Imagine the morning of July 17th, 1453. The air over Gascony is thick and humid, smelling of river water from the nearby Dordogne, of sun-warmed earth and mown grass. In a field known as the Champ de Saint-Laurent, near the town of Castillon, a strange, almost industrial silence reigns. There is no clatter of knightly armor here. Instead, there is the methodical creak of wheels, the dull thud of hammers, and quiet, precise commands. This is the camp of Jean Bureau, Grand Master of the Artillery of King Charles VII. Here he and his brother Gaspar, men of a new age, have created something unprecedented, a fortified park bristling with the muzzles of 300 cannons, culverins and heavy bombards lined up like the pipes of a diabolical organ, face the road. They are not waiting for a duel. They are waiting for a target. Many miles away, in England, King Henry VI is drowning in a fog of madness. But his will, the will of England, is embodied here by a man of legend, John Talbot, 1st Earl of Shrewsbury, the English Achilles. He is nearly 70, and his entire life has been the roar of battle, the clash of steel on steel, a glory and honor won in hundreds of skirmishes. He is the living embodiment of a passing era, a knight to the core. When he is told that the French are fleeing their camp in a panic, the familiar fire ignites in his old heart. Glory awaits. One more, final, great victory. What did he feel in that moment? Triumph? Or the blind rage of an old lion that scents easy prey? He did not wait for reconnaissance. He did not wait for his famous longbowmen who had been left behind. Pride, honed by decades of victory, pushed him forward. He led his Anglo-Gascon knights in a charge, straight into the open jaws of the trap, which had been set with mathematical precision by Jean Bureau. For Talbot, this was a fight. For Bureau, it was an equation, with living flesh and courage on one side, and calculated trajectory, gunpowder, and cast iron on the other. And so they charge forward. Banners fly, battle cries tear the morning air. And then, the silence is shattered. A symphony of destruction begins, conducted by the Bureau brothers. This is not the whistle of arrows in the air. This is a thunder that shakes the earth. Stone and iron cannonballs smash into the dense ranks of the attackers with monstrous force. Armor that could have saved a man from a sword or a spear shatters like an eggshell. Horses and riders are turned into a bloody pulp. This is not a battle. It is an industrial slaughter. Even when a cannonball kills the horse beneath him, old Talbot, true to his code, continues to fight on foot. But what is he fighting against? Against a faceless mechanical force that cares nothing for his glory or his name. Soon, surrounded and stunned, he is finished off. They say it was with a blow from a battle axe. The English Achilles did not fall at the hands of an equal hero, but as a victim of a new, ruthless logic of war. His death became a symbol for the death of an entire era. This was not just the final battle of the 100 Years' War. It was the moment when the steel of the knight's sword finally yielded to gunpowder and the cannonball. The Battle of Castillon did not just end 300 years of English rule in Gascony. It drew a thick, bloody line, beyond which the age of chivalric valor ended, and the age of engineered warfare began. Imagine a road, once straight as an arrow, paved with heavy stones by order of an emperor, along which legions marched and wagons rolled with grain for Rome. And now grass pushes up through those stones. The wind blows through the ruins of a roadside station where horses are no longer changed. It carries the smell of damp earth and distant campfires, not the aroma of baked bread and wine from a tavern. Silence. A profound, ringing silence where the pulse of civilization once beat. A man walks along this road. He is dressed in a coarse tunic, but his bearing and gaze betray a different origin. Perhaps he is the descendant of a senator whose villa, over there on the hill, is now just an empty shell with shattered windows. Inside, a broken mosaic of Dionysus on the floor stares up at an empty sky, and in the library where his grandfather read Cicero, scrolls rot in the autumn rain. What does he feel in this moment? A sharp, piercing grief for a world that promised order and eternity, or a strange, frightening sense of freedom, relief at the fall of a giant whose shadow covered everything, but whose bones had long been eaten away from within? His world, a world of Latin, law, and aqueducts, has evaporated. Power now speaks another, guttural language. Its laws are not carved on the bronze tablets of the Forum. They are written with long swords on the very soil of Gaul. Up north, a Salian Frankish chief named Clovis is not trying to restore Rome. He is building his own kingdom, the kingdom of the Franks, on its bones. His warriors do not know Virgil, but they know the value of loyalty to a chieftain and the sharpness of their axes. Their faith is a strange mixture of old pagan gods and a new Arian Christianity, which Orthodox Rome considered a heresy. And what of the south? In Italy, in Ravenna itself, sits Theodoric the Great, an Ostrogoth, a man who grew up as a hostage in Constantinople, who knows the majesty of the empire, but who remained a barbarian at heart. He is trying to do the impossible, to fuse the Roman legacy with Gothic strength, to make wolves and sheep drink from the same stream. He preserves the Senate, repairs aqueducts, but he rules over a people of warriors, alien to this land. In Spain, there are the Visigoths. In North Africa, the Vandals, who had plundered the eternal city itself. The single mosaic of the empire has shattered into 1,000 pieces, and each barbarian king is trying to assemble his own rough, vibrant pattern from the shards. Who is this man on the road now? No longer a citizen of Rome, but not yet a subject of a Frankish king. He is dust at the crossroads of epochs, a living witness to a tectonic fault line in history. This was not simply the fall of an empire. It was the agonizing birth of nations from its flesh. On the ruins of a universal world, where anyone could say civis Romanus sum, new local identities were emerging, bound not by a common law, but by a common language, faith, and loyalty to a new king. The scar this event left on the body of Europe is one of eternal fragmentation, the end of the idea of a single universal order, the seeds of which would sprout into future wars and future great cultures. From a curse that doomed a dynasty to a faith that revived a nation, from chivalric pride shattered by commoners' arrows to an imperial order that crumbled to dust. We have seen how history is not a smooth-flowing river, but a series of ruptures where old worlds collapse to make way for new ones. But as we look at these scars of the past, do we not ask ourselves, on what myths does our own world stand? And in the hum of our high-speed networks and the silence of our automated factories, can we not hear that same quiet crackle, the sound of the tectonic shifts that always precede great upheavals? What are your thoughts on this? Share them in the comments. If you enjoy these deep dives into history, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like, so we know this work is important. Until next time.